They thought she was just a sweet old widow with a garden, easy to ignore, easy to mock. But when a gang of bikers destroyed the flowers she'd tended for 60 years, she made one quiet phone call, and everything changed. No shouting, no threats, just silence. And then a series of calculated moves that dismantled an entire criminal operation without firing a single shot. What the town didn't know was that Eleanor Mayfield wasn't just planting flowers, she was protecting a legacy. And when pushed, she didn't wilt. She bloomed into something they never saw coming. Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The sun rose slowly over Redstone Hollow, casting a soft orange light through the trees that lined the quiet streets. It was the kind of morning that belonged to postcards and memory still, hushed and humming faintly with birdsong. The town had not yet fully woken, and only a few windows glowed with the warm promise of brewing coffee. Eleanor Mayfield's house sat on the northeast edge of the main road, near the post office and just beyond the Presbyterian church, with its stubborn bell that hadn't rung on time since 1997. Her house had stood there for more than half a century, unchanged except for the layers of paint that softened with each season. Eleanor woke before the sun most days, out of habit more than necessity. Her bones didn't like being still too long, and her joints whispered their disapproval if she stayed in bed past 6. She moved carefully, with the quiet grace of someone who had once been strong and still remembered how it felt. By the time the clock in the hallway struck 7, she had tied her pale blue robe, fed the cat, and opened the side door that led to the garden she had tended for 62 years. She didn't scream, she didn't even gasp. Her breath caught, but not in a theatrical way, just a slight hitch, like a stitch in fabric. Where the snapdragons used to bloom in their neat rose colors fading from buttercream to coral to violet, there was now a streak of mud and crushed petals, wide and cruel and unforgiving. Tire tracks had carved through the heart of the soil, dragging along roots and uprooting decades of careful tending. The lavender bush by the gate was snapped in half. One of the wrought iron trellises she'd welded with her late husband in the early 70s was bent so far it leaned like a drunk man in the wind. Crushed beer cans glittered between the wreckage, half buried in soil that had once been turned gently by hand. A torn leather glove lay near the edge of the fence, its fingers curled like they were still clinging to the handlebar that dropped it. There were footprints too, heavy and deliberate, and in one spot, where the garden hose had been coiled, there were cigarette butts arranged in a careless little circle like someone had squatted there and stayed a while. Watching her house from the shadows, Eleanor took a step forward, her slipper sinking slightly into the torn earth. The smell was wrong. It should have been damp with morning dew and the first scent of budding rosemary. Instead, it smelled like engine oil and stale tobacco. She bent slowly, ignoring the tight pull in her lower back, and picked up one of the snapdragons. Its stem was cleanly snapped, not trampled, not bruised cut. Almost she turned it over in her palm, thumb brushing the ruined blossom. Her face didn't change, no tears, no fury, just the faint downward tilt of her mouth, like a stitch being tugged from old fabric. From across the street, Mrs. Loring's curtains twitched. A curtain always twitched in a town like Redstone Hollow, but no one came out to say anything. Not even a word. The town had learned to pretend it didn't notice things, it didn't understand, and right now, no one quite knew what to make of a group of bikers tearing through the garden of the oldest. Woman on the block? Eleanor straightened, slowly, the snapdragon still in her hand. She turned back toward the house, her steps even. Once inside, she placed the broken flower into a chipped ceramic pitcher that had belonged to her mother, then moved through the kitchen without a sound. The cat meowed at her feet, but she didn't stop. At the far end of the hallway, beneath a framed photograph of her and her husband in their navy uniforms, hung an old rotary phone in a soft shade of cream. She lifted the receiver. The line clicked once before the tone came through. Her fingers, though aged and bent, dialed a number with practiced speed. She didn't need to check a list. She hadn't dialed it in almost 4 decades, but her hands remembered on the third. Ring. Someone picked up. There was silence. Then Eleanor said, "It's me." Another silence, then a voice, low, steady, unmistakably alert. "Where do you need us?" The first sound was distant, a low, mechanical growl rolling over the hills like a warning thunder. It started faint, blending with the wind and the occasional truck passing through Redstone Hollow's single intersection. But as the seconds ticked by, the sound swelled, deepened, and sharpened into something unmistakable. Motorcycles. Not one or two, a swarm. The kind of sound that didn't belong to this town, where noise was kept to lawnmowers, church bells, and the occasional argument at Miller's Hardware over paint samples. At precisely 2:17 in the afternoon, the quiet rhythm of Willow Street was split open. Birds scattered from their perches. Wind chimes clanged wildly against porch beams. And Eleanor Mayfield, sitting calmly at her kitchen window with a cup of black tea in one hand and a crossword puzzle in the other, glanced up as the first bike appeared over the ridge. They came in a pack, maybe a dozen or more leather jackets, flapping, helmets gleaming, boots scraping sparks as they leaned into the turn near the corner of her property. They didn't slow down for the posted sign that read "Children at Play" or the faded white fence she had painted herself 3 summers ago. Their engines snarled. Their exhaust left the air tasting like burnt oil and spite, and their jeering, unfiltered, pierced every window on the block. Eleanor didn't move. She simply set her pencil down. The first bike clipped her mailbox with a clang. The second swerved intentionally closer, scraping along the curb and showering her. Iris bed with loose gravel. The third, heavier, louder, pulled into her yard entirely. Its tires dug trenches through her grass, and the rider broad-shouldered, sunburned. With a jagged tattoo curling up his neck, let out a whoop as he revved the engine just before slamming. Through the center of the garden path, more followed. The roar of their arrival drowned out the wind, the birds, and the world. They circled like dogs claiming territory. Not for long, but long enough to let her know they had chosen this spot for a reason. Whether it was random or intentional didn't matter. What mattered was what they left behind. One of them, thin, twitchy, no helmet, hurled a half-empty bottle of beer toward her porch. It shattered near the steps, scattering glass across the welcome mat that read, "Come back with pie." Another tossed a cigarette into the flower bed. The ember hissed against the damp soil but smoldered for several seconds, sending up a faint wisp of smoke that curled around the broken stems of her snapdragons. Inside, Eleanor stood. She moved slowly, deliberately. She walked past the hallway, photographs some fading, some framed with care. Her late husband, Raymond, standing in uniform beside a jet. Her grandson in his graduation robes, a black and white photo of her with 3 other women in fatigues, smiling like they'd just broken something that needed breaking. By the time she reached the front door, the bikers were already turning back toward the street. One of them laughed so hard he slapped his own knee, pointed at the tire tracks carved through the rose beds. Another revved his engine, sending a blast of dust toward the porch. The leader, if there was one, gave a sharp whistle, and the bikes began to peel away. Not in a hurry, just finished, like boys leaving a prank. They never expected to be held accountable for. They didn't look back. Eleanor stepped outside and let the screen door close behind her. She didn't yell. She didn't curse. She didn't call out for help or wave a broom in the air. She simply stood on her porch, eyes fixed on the horizon, the last engine growl fading into the hills. Her garden was wrecked, not just trampled, but violated rows of perennials, uprooted, soil churned like a battlefield. Her fence sagged where one of them had clipped the corner. A single glove, black leather with the fingers cut off, lay on her front path like a forgotten insult. She walked down the steps and into the mess, her slippers silent in the dirt. She knelt not quickly, not easily, but with the practiced control of someone who'd learned long ago how to work through Penand, picked up a broken tulip bulb. It was crushed beyond saving. Still, she held it in her palm for a moment, then she looked up not at the destruction, but toward the road they'd come from, and for a few long seconds, she didn't look like someone's grandmother. She looked like someone waiting, calculating, remembering. Then she turned and went back inside. The screen door didn't slam. It clicked shut with a quiet finality. The last rumble of exhaust had long faded into the hills, but the scent lingered: oil, dust, burnt rubber, and something else. Something sharp and deliberate. It hung over the wreckage like a sneer. Eleanor stepped carefully between torn stalks and shattered stems. her house slippers stirring the soil she had tended nearly every morning since her husband's funeral. The garden had been her steady thing, the one place that kept its rhythm even when everything else forgot how. She didn't call the police. She didn't knock on the neighbors' doors or wave down the postal truck. The town didn't move quickly for women like Eleanor anymore. Not because they didn't care, though some didn't, but because they thought she had aged past the need for urgency. That someone her age should be grateful just to have her name remembered, even if no one bothered to ask how she was getting by. She had become background until now. She stopped near the center path, where the stones had been overturned by a thick tire. The hydrangeas were flattened, their blue petals pressed into the dirt as if they'd been stepped on by boots that didn't know how to tread lightly. Her knees creaked as she lowered herself beside them. It wasn't easy, hadn't been for years, but she did it without hesitation. Slowly, steadily, she reached for one bloom that had escaped full destruction. Its edges were browned, its stem crooked, but a bit of color still clung to it. She brushed the dirt from the petals with the back of her hand, not hard enough to clean it, just enough to feel it. Her fingers, lined and knotted with time, trembled slightly, not from anger, but from the memory of what this garden used to look like in the spring of 1972, when Raymond still brought her coffee before sunrise and whistled while he weeded the marigolds. It had been his idea to build the lattice near the porch, her idea to grow sweet peas on it. The quiet of the yard now was almost cruel. No apology, no explanation. Just the wreckage and the humming sound of a cicada somewhere in the trees beyond the back fence. She didn't speak, not to herself, not to the flowers, not to the sky. The silence was deliberate, measured, a space being created not out of shock, but out of strategy. She pressed one hand against the earth to steady herself, and rose dust clung to her palms. She didn't wipe it off. Inside the house, the light had shifted. The kitchen was warm, golden, familiar. Her teacup still sat on the windowsill, the crossword puzzle untouched beside it. She closed the door behind her, gently, and clicked the lock even though the town hadn't seen a true break-in since 1985. That one had been a misunderstanding, and the burglar had left with a fruitcake he later returned. Eleanor didn't reach for the phone right away. Instead, she stood still for a full minute in the narrow hallway lined with photographs. She looked at the one of Raymond again, his smile, the kind of quiet confidence men used to carry before they explained less and did more. Beside it, in a smaller frame, was a picture of her at Fort Clayton in Panama, standing in front of a field radio. She had been 21 then, wearing the same expression she wore now, serious, alert, still. She walked to the coat closet. It still smelled faintly of cedar and old wool. Tucked into the back behind a faded umbrella was a shoebox. The lid lifted easily. Inside, a piece of paper with a single number scribbled in blue ink. She hadn't used that number in decades, but she had never once thought of throwing it away. She carried the paper into the kitchen and set it next to the phone. Then, without a sound, she sat at the table and finished her tea, still warm, still steeped just the way she liked it. No panic, no shouting, no tears, just the kind of silence that says, "I've seen worse, and I've already decided what comes next." The kitchen was so still you could hear the faint ticking of the old wall clock, a rhythm that had measured decades of quiet mornings and long, slow afternoons. Outside, the wind moved through the damaged garden, lifting loose petals and scattering them across the porch like forgotten confetti. The wreckage sat untouched. Eleanor hadn't gone back out. She didn't need to. What needed to be done now wouldn't involve a broom or a rake. The rotary phone hung on the far wall of the kitchen, cream-colored with a coiled cord that had yellowed with time. It hadn't rung in years. Most people who knew Eleanor called her landline only when they couldn't find her at the market or during Thursday quilting club. But this wasn't a call she was waiting to receive. This was one she had always known she might have to make. One she'd rehearsed in her mind more times than she could count, even as the world forgot the part of her that used to matter. She reached for it slowly, without hesitation, her fingers curled around the receiver. The weight of it felt almost ceremonial, like a lever being pulled. To begin a process already in motion, her left hand hovered over the dial. The numbers weren't written down anymore. They never had been, but they were there, fixed in her memory as firmly as the names of her children and the scent of the lilacs that used to bloom outside her bedroom window. 196, the metal dial, clicked back each time with a soft shudder. 7, 2, 3. Her finger paused briefly over the final number. Then 4. The line clicked. Then silence. Not static, not noise. Just a clean, open stillness, like the air in a sealed room. She didn't speak right away. There was no greeting, no confirmation. It was the kind of call that bypassed formality. A line maintained not for conversation, but for necessity. For a few seconds, nothing. Then a breath. A man's older now, slower, but unmistakable. She didn't give her name. She didn't have to. "It's time," she said. There was no reply. Not at first. Just a low intake of breath, followed by the faintest scrape of movement on the other end. Then the line disconnected. She replaced the receiver gently. The way someone might fold a flag, outside, the wind picked up slightly, rustling through the bent trellis and scattering crushed leaves across the garden path. A loose can rolled down the slope and lodged itself under the porch steps. Eleanor didn't go out to pick it up. She didn't need to. She returned to the table and sat down slowly, folding her hands in her lap. The clock ticked on. Her tea had gone cold. A crow landed on the fence post and looked around curiously before hopping down into the mess of overturned soil. She watched it peck at a crushed stem, then lose interest and flutter off again by the time the sun had moved past the kitchen window. The light had changed, sharpened at the edges, more direct. Eleanor stood once more, this time with a subtle shift in her movement, not just steady, braced. She walked down the hallway and stopped at a cabinet no one ever touched. The key hung from a nail behind a painting of the Smoky Mountains. She unlocked the cabinet, opened the drawer, and removed a file marked only with a faded symbol 3 stars, red ink, nothing more. Inside, photographs, maps, names. She didn't open it yet. Instead, she placed the file on the kitchen table beside her tea and waited. She knew what would come next. There would be a knock. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. And when it came, they wouldn't need to introduce themselves. They would have the same look in their eyes as she did. The same sense that time hadn't erased everything, that some things had only been waiting. The call had been short. No questions asked, just a thread picked up where it had been left. Almost 4 decades before Dot, it was enough. The afternoon haze settled low over Redstone Hollow, softening the edges of things. Mailboxes shimmered in the heat. The asphalt glistened faintly, and the few pedestrians out at that hour moved slowly, shielding their eyes from the glare. Nothing about the day suggested change. If anything, it suggested stillness, the kind of stillness that lives in towns, where routine has become religion. Then came the SUV. It wasn't loud. It didn't rumble or screech or draw attention with noise. It moved quietly, almost politely, down Main Street, its tires gliding over the road like they'd been here before. It had no plates, no dealership stickers, no bumper scuffs or window tint that tried too hard. It was black matte, not glossy, unbranded, unreadable. The kind of vehicle that didn't ask questions and didn't answer any either. It slowed at the corner of Willow and Hartley, rolled past the bakery where old men played checkers every Thursday, and came to a stop at the curb in front of Eleanor Mayfield's house. The engine cut, the door opened. He stepped out with the kind of precision that made it immediately clear he hadn't worn a suit for decoration. The fabric held no wrinkles. His shoes left no sound on the concrete. His face was unremarkable in a way that made you notice it more. His hair was close-cropped, dark, and graying slightly at the temples, though not from age. His expression didn't shift as he scanned the property. Not with pity, not with outrage, just a practiced, clinical sort of reading. He took in the crushed garden, the damaged trellis, the beer cans, the scuff marks in the soil, everything. Then, his eyes landed on the porch. Eleanor was there, sitting, not hiding, not standing to greet him, just waiting, as if he were the mailman running late or a friend dropping by to return a dish. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. Her sun hat sat beside her on the bench, untouched. Her cardigan was buttoned up. To the color, even in the heat, she looked like any small-town widow enjoying the shade except. Her gaze met his without blinking. He gave a single nod. She nodded back. He ascended the porch steps without a word and stood just inside the shade. Looking down at her garden, after a long moment, he spoke. His voice was quiet, unhurried. There was nothing casual about it. "Where do you need us?" Eleanor looked up at him. Her face didn't soften. She didn't smile, but her eyes held a flicker of something that had been buried a long time. Not relief, not triumph, recognition. "Same place," she said. "Same parameters." He nodded once. No follow-up questions, no clipboard. He didn't ask who us meant. He already knew Dot from the SUV. The back door opened. Two more figures stepped out, one male, one female. Both moved with the same calculated stillness. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Each carried a black case, no logos, no visible hardware. The woman was younger, maybe late 30s, her blonde hair pulled into a tight knot. The man older, barrel-chested, with a limp he didn't seem to mind. They walked toward the house without hesitation. Eleanor rose to her feet, slow but steady. She reached into the small pocket of her cardigan and handed the suited man a single key. It was old, slightly rusted at the edges, and tied to a string of faded blue yarn. "The shed," she said. "You'll find what's left of the Comes kit. It's buried under the wheelbarrow." The man took the key without looking at it. Understood that others were already rounding the house, their footfalls light, the kind of light that came from training, not courtesy. Eleanor watched them disappear behind the edge of her porch. The suited man turned once more toward the garden. Know who they were dealing with? It wasn't a question, and Eleanor didn't answer it. She simply sat back down. "We'll start before dusk," he added. "That way the town doesn't see what it doesn't need to." Eleanor nodded again, as if confirming a dinner order. The man stepped off the porch. The SUV's trunk lifted soundlessly. Inside were cases, equipment, a rolled tarp. No weapons visible, but none were needed to make the point. By sundown, the garden would still be broken, but the message would be underway, and this time, it wouldn't be written in flowers. The screen door creaked as Rhodes stepped inside, letting it close behind him with a soft click. He didn't ask permission, and Eleanor didn't offer it. Some people required ceremony, not them. The house greeted him with the faint scent of lavender and linseed oil, the same combination it always had. Not because she tried to preserve the past, but because she never saw a reason to change what worked. Rhodes paused just inside the threshold. His shoes clean, his posture straight. He hadn't aged the way most men did. The gray in his hair had arrived, but the lines in his face had settled with precision, not weariness. His eyes scanned the living room with the calm detachment of someone who had walked into far more dangerous rooms and lived to compare their wallpaper. A wooden hutch with porcelain figurines, a grandfather clock that ticked half a beat to slow, doilies on the armrests, stitched with thread that had seen for decades of dust and sun. Eleanor stood by the table, not moving toward him, not away. She was wearing a pale green dress with sleeves pushed to her elbows, and her apron still had a dusting of flour on it from the pie she'd been rolling out before the garden fell under tire tracks and boot scuffs. She didn't reach to shake his hand. She didn't ask him how the drive was. She only lifted her chin slightly, a gesture that might have seemed meaningless to anyone else, but not to him. He responded in kinda subtle glance toward the hallway, a small incline of his head. The silence between them was heavy, but not awkward. It was shaped, intentional. A familiar rhythm to those who had once spoken in code, moved in shadows, and trusted that what didn't need to be said was still understood. Rhodes set a black case gently on the floor beside the old armchair. The floorboards didn't creak under his weight. They knew better. She turned and walked into the kitchen. The kettle was already warming on the stove, not because she expected company, but because muscle memory still followed the old schedule. Tea at 4, calls at 5, readiness by 6. Rhodes followed, but didn't sit. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his eyes on the wall near the pantry where a faded photograph of 5 uniformed young men and 1 woman, Eleanor, in the center hung in a frame that hadn't been dusted in months. He didn't ask about the others. He already knew. 3 buried, 1 in hospice, 1 off-grid in Idaho. Eleanor was the last one still on the record and still active, if only in principle. He didn't need to say any of that. He just looked at the photo for a moment longer than he had to, then turned his attention to her kitchen counter. "You still have the radio?" he asked, his voice low and even, the first words he'd spoken since he arrived. "In the cellar," she replied. "Wrapped in the quilt Raymond hated. Still holds signal." Rhodes allowed a brief flicker of amusement to touch his mouth. Barely there, but real good. Eleanor poured the tea. No sugar, no cream. They both drank it the same way. She placed one cup near the edge of the table. Not looking at him as she did, Rhodes stepped forward and took it without thanks. Not out of rudeness, out of trust, he sat, slowly. Like a man who knew the value of silence before strategy, she joined him. There was a long pause, the kind that settled like dust in the corners, filling the space between who they used to be and what they were about to become again. Finally, Eleanor spoke. They didn't just pick the wrong house. Rhodes nodded once. They picked the one with a cellar full of unfinished business. No need for plans. Not yet. Those would come. The others would arrive. In time, the pieces would move. But for now, the watchman had returned. And the widow hadn't forgotten how to begin. On Saturdays, Redstone Hollow came to life slowly. The market square filled with folding tables and canvas tents, the kind that flapped gently in the breeze and smelled faintly of canvas and spilled coffee. Eleanor Mayfield had her spot near the far end, just beneath the elm tree that leaned ever so slightly toward the post office. Her table was always the same, neat, quiet, dependable. Mason jars of cut flowers arranged with a precision that seemed too practiced for something so delicate. Peonies in the spring, dahlias in the summer, snapdragons whenever they'd take a hand-painted sign, faded but legible, hung from the edge, Eleanor's blooms. She never charged much, just enough to keep the stand going. The high school girls bought single stems to press into books. Retired couples bought bundles for kitchen vases. Even the mayor's assistant stopped by once a month to buy a mixed bouquet for the front desk. Everyone greeted her the same way. "Morning, miss." Mayfield, looking lovely as ever, still up before the sun. "Huh," she always smiled, soft, polite, said just enough to send them on their way with flowers and a good feeling. People liked that about her, that she didn't talk too much, that she wasn't loud or opinionated, that she kept to herself, but never unkindly. She was, in most people's eyes, exactly what an old woman ought to be: gentle, reliable, no trouble at all. But they didn't know her, not really. They didn't know that her name hadn't always been Mayfield, that she had once gone by another name entirely. A name that, if spoken aloud in the right rooms, would draw silence. Not fear, not admiration, just respect. The kind that doesn't get written in local papers or carved into plaques. The kind that doesn't fade even when the person who earned it vanishes from the record. The younger ones, store clerks, delivery drivers, new couples with strollers, knew nothing beyond the garden. Some of the older residents remembered Raymond, her husband, and a few could even recall he'd been in the Navy. But they thought Eleanor had just followed him along his career, cooking on bases, writing letters. They didn't know she was once the one issuing field reports, that she spoke 5 languages before age 20, that she had trained agents in psychological operations and knew how to build a communications relay out of spare wires and a transistor radio. They didn't know the lilies on her table were grown above a root cellar that had once stored signal equipment, or that her garage still held an inert tracking drone beneath a shelf of Christmas decorations. A few had wondered, over the years, how she managed to live so independently, how her house was always just a bit more secure than seemed necessary, how the motion lights around her garden weren't wired through the local grid, but they'd chalked it up to eccentricity, widowhood, boredom. Only one man still remembered: Sheriff Blake Harlan. He was young when they first met, just a patrol deputy with something to prove and a bad habit of underestimating people. He had responded to a burglary call at her home in the mid-90s, back when she still walked with a cane, more for appearances than need. When he arrived, the would-be intruder was already zip-tied to her radiator. Eleanor met him at the door, holding a cup of tea. "Please be gentle," she'd said calmly. "He seems nervous." He never asked questions after that, not about the gear in her attic or the antenna array hidden behind her roses. If someone filed a complaint about noise coming from her shed at 3 a.m., he handled it personally, always walked away quieter than before. She wasn't dangerous, he knew that, but she was something rarer, trained. The town never asked who trained her, or why, or what she used to be, and Eleanor never offered it. She didn't need to. Redstone Hollow saw what they wanted to see: an old woman with steady hands and a soft voice who sold flowers and walked to church every Sunday but beneath the surface. Behind the petals and the politeness lived a history no one had the clearance to read, a history with teeth. And now, whether the town knew it or not, that history had just been activated. The cedar chest creaked as Eleanor lifted the lid, the hinges resisting at first like they hadn't been disturbed in years. Dust shimmered in the slanted afternoon light that filtered through her bedroom curtains, catching in the air like old secrets finely given breath. The scent of cedar was sharp, unmistakable, preserved through time, sealed tight against rot and memory. Inside were a few items, nothing outwardly remarkable: a folded quilt with fraying edges, a bundle of letters tied with navy blue ribbon, a pair of thick wool socks that had once belonged to Raymond, worn thin at the heels but kept anyway. And beneath it all, flat and nearly hidden, lay the folder she reached for it with both hands, not because it was heavy, but because it deserved both. The manila was faded, the corners bent and slightly cracked. Across the cover, barely visible unless the light hit just right, were 3 red stars. No text, no agency markings, just that symbol classification above top secret, used only for operations deemed unspeakable by necessity. Rhodes stood at the doorway. He hadn't moved since she entered the room. He didn't ask what she was looking for. He knew. When she turned with the folder in her hands, he nodded once. The gesture was subtle, but it carried the weight of something formal, like a switch being flipped or an oath being renewed. They returned to the kitchen, where the air was cooler, denser. The folder hit the table with a soft thud as Eleanor laid it open. Inside were pages yellowed with age, but neatly preserved in plastic sleeves. There were maps of Redstone Hollow, drawn by hand, annotated with codes in the margins. Notes on infrastructure lines, electrical boxes, traffic patterns, profiles of properties long since renovated, people long since gone. Rhodes pulled a chair back, but didn't sit. "This is older than I expected," he said quietly. Eleanor didn't look up. She flipped a page, revealing a blueprint of her own. House down to the basement, the crawl space, even the hidden compartment behind the pantry. "I started drafting it in '86, updated every 5 years," she replied. "The original was called Operation Hearthstone. We changed the name after Raymond died." He leaned in slightly to get a better view. "Garden Vow. That's what I called it," she said. "Because if they ever came for what we built, here, this house, this town, there'd be a response, and it wouldn't be quiet." She slid the folder toward him. He opened another sleeve. Inside was a list of names. Some were crossed out. Some had check marks. Some had question marks next to them. "These are your old contacts." They were. Some may still be viable. The check marks mean I've seen or heard from them within the last 10 years. Rhodes studied the names. A few stood out. One in particular, Joan Vickers, had a triple check next to it. He raised an eyebrow. "She's in Richmond now," Eleanor said, reading his expression. "Runs a veterans outreach clinic, but she still has the old channels." She answered the call. He didn't ask how she was so sure. Back and pulled a slim black tablet from the case he'd brought. It powered on silently. As he tapped through secure layers of encryption, Eleanor retrieved a battered spiral notebook from the kitchen drawer. She tore out a page and began writing numbers in clean, tight script, coordinates, time blocks, frequencies. "You never stopped planning," he said. She paused, then looked up at him. "You never stopped watching. We all stayed ready in our own ways." They worked in tandem without another word. The house quiet, except for the occasional creak of floorboards and the hum of the refrigerator. Outside, Redstone Hollow remained oblivious, moving through its usual routine of lawn mowing and grocery runs, and polite nods exchanged at four-way stops. But inside the Mayfield home, Operation Garden Vow had begun, and it would not be unwritten. The tavern sat just off County Route 12, its rusted sign swinging unevenly in the wind, creaking like a broken weather vane. Inside, the air was thick with sweat, old wood, and the sour tang of beer that had soaked into the floorboards over the years. It was the kind of place that didn't welcome outsiders, but didn't mind them, either so long as they didn't ask questions and paid in cash. The bikers had taken over the back corner by the pool table, pushing 3 tables together to accommodate their noise. Jackets slung over chairs, boots propped on stools, helmets dropped unceremoniously onto the floor. They filled the space with laughter loud and self-satisfied and, a kind of brash energy that belonged to people who believed consequences only. Applied to other people, they were still talking about the house. The granny, as one of them had called her, was now the centerpiece of their war stories, exaggerated and twisted with each retelling. Tank, a heavy-set man with a voice like gravel and the lungs of a lifelong smoker, slapped his beer down and mimicked her voice in falsetto. She just stood there on the porch, he crowed, wheezing between gulps, didn't even blink, like she was carved out of wood. Another man, young rail-thin, and too eager to impress, cackled and slammed his fist on the table. You see the look on her face when you ran over them flowers? I swear, I thought, she was going to throw a knitting needle at you. She didn't even yell, someone added from the edge of the group. Just stared like she was judging your whole bloodline. They erupted again, this time louder, the beer doing its work. Darts were thrown lazily at a faded board near the jukebox. One bounced off and landed near a waitress's foot, but no one apologized. The staff, mostly locals, knew better than to intervene when the riders rolled through. The bartender, a wiry man named Dennis with a white apron and a haunted look, kept his eyes low and his pores generous. The leader, if they had once sat a little apart from the rest. He didn't laugh as much, but he smiled in that slow, deliberate way that meant he liked being in control. His name was Deke, short for Deacon, though no one used the full name anymore. He wore a black vest with no insignia, no patch, nothing. To link him to any official chapter, that alone should have raised questions. But no one in Redstone Hollow had asked them, and the sheriff hadn't stopped by. Deke leaned back in his chair and lit a cigarette, his boots resting on the stool across from him. He watched his men as they joked and jeered, throwing around mock impressions of elderly voices and pretending to limp like they'd broken a hip. His smile stayed fixed, but his eyes didn't reflect it. There was calculation in them, something sharp behind the stillness. He didn't think much of Eleanor. Not really. She was just a symbol to them, a mark, a place to burn off energy before moving on. But Deke also didn't like when things felt too easy. He'd grown up under men who believed in gut instinct, and his gut told him something about that woman had been ... off. Not in the way old people could be off. In the way old dogs sometimes didn't bark, but bit straight through bone when you turned your back. Still, he said nothing. Not yet, outside, parked beneath the crooked light pole, their bikes gleamed in the fading sun, engines cooling, chains rattling gently in the breeze. One of the younger riders had hung a patch over his handlebars that read, "Fear None," stitched in red dot. No one noticed the figure across the street, parked in an unmarked sedan with the windows cracked just enough to let the camera lens out. Someone watched. Camera clicks were muffled, timed with the bursts of laughter from inside. License plates, faces, timelines, every entry and exit noted. Every rider's name matched 2 records pulled from systems not available to the general public. The watcher didn't drink, didn't blink, didn't speak. They were here because a call had gone out, not to police, not to local law enforcement, but to people who worked beneath that level, people whose job it was to remember names like Deke's before anyone else knew them. Back inside, Deke crushed his cigarette in the ashtray and narrowed his eyes toward the window. Just for a moment, the laughter continued, but outside, someone was already writing the ending. The sun dipped low behind the rooftops of Redstone Hollow, bathing the town in the kind of amber light that made things look softer than they were. Shadows stretched long across sidewalks and driveways, and the hum of cicadas rose just loud enough to cover the finer sounds, the click of latches, the subtle shuffle of boots across grass, the snap of a small metal box sliding into place beneath the soil. Rhodes crouched near the back edge of Eleanor's garden, just behind the patch where the roses once bloomed with stubborn brilliance each spring. The plants were gone, now ripped out by tires and careless boots, but the root system remained, fractured but intact. He brushed away a few loose leaves and pulled back the dry top layer of soil with gloved fingers. From the pouch at his belt, he retrieved a device no larger than a matchbox, black and unmarked. It had no blinking lights, no antenna, no numbers, just one recessed button and a small notch on its underside that clicked faintly when pressed against earth. He pressed it into the dirt with the kind of care one might give to planting a seed. Then he stood, brushed off his gloves, and surveyed the yard. The transmitter would begin broadcasting at dusk. piggybacking on municipal lighting circuits and riding the forgotten copper veins of the town's outdated electrical grid. Most would mistake the signal for nothing at all static background hum, heat distortion. But the right ears would hear it. The right receivers would wake. He gave a small nod to Eleanor, who stood at the edge of the porch, watching without comment. She didn't need to ask what he had just buried. She had drawn this schematic 23 years ago and updated it. After the garden fence was rebuilt in 2011, the honeysuckle had been her idea: natural camouflage to disguise the signals. Source: no one looked closely at ornamental vines. Rhodes turned and walked calmly back toward the house. Eleanor didn't follow him inside. She remained at the porch railing, her hands resting on the wood like she was just taking in the evening air. Across town, the lights flickered once at the old warehouse on Durant Street. Just a quick pulse to faint to notice unless you were looking for it. The building had long since fallen out of use. Officially, it had been a textile storage facility, then briefly a firework distribution center, before it was condemned for failing to meet new code requirements. But tucked in the northwest corner of the structure was a breaker box that had never been disconnected from the town's core utility line. Not completely. Inside the warehouse, two men stood beside a panel that hadn't been touched in years, at least not openly. The taller one, with thick white eyebrows and a jaw like a railroad spike, turned a knob slowly, watching as the monitor above the panel flickered to life. The other, smaller and stoop-shouldered, adjusted a dial with hands that trembled more from habit than age. They looked like electricians, writered ones at that. Both wore coveralls stained with paint and age. They even had matching baseball caps from a roofing company that had closed in 2003. But the equipment in front of them was nothing any contractor in Redstone Hollow had ever used. There were no logos, no instruction labels, no plastic casings, just brushed steel, toggles, and analog meters calibrated down to the thousandth. "We're live," said the smaller man, tapping the side of the monitor. "Signals. Clean." The taller man leaned forward and squinted at the frequency readout. A thin green line danced across the screen, oscillating in perfect rhythm with the buried transmitter behind Eleanor's house. "She's running it through the east side grid," he muttered. "Smart piggybacks off the library's backup line. No one checks that circuit after hours." The smaller man cracked his knuckles, then began flipping switches in a precise sequence, each one timed to coincide with pulses in the signal. "You think she's really calling everyone back?" he asked, without looking up. "She made the call," the tall man said simply. "That's all that matters." Outside, night settled fully over Redstone Hollow. Porch lights clicked on one by one, motion sensors blinking to life as shadows moved across driveways and narrow alleys. But in that warehouse, behind rusted doors and boarded windows, the signal beneath the honeysuckle found its way across wires, across silence, into the hands of those who had been waiting. They didn't need explanations, just the signal, and that it had come from her. The first to arrive came just after dawn, when the air still held a trace of dew, and the birds hadn't yet decided whether to sing or stay quiet. He didn't knock, just stood by the gate with a paper bag in one hand and a cane in the other, his coat buttoned all the way up despite the warm breeze. His name, at least the one he used now, was Harvey Dunn. Gray hair trimmed close, one eye nearly white from a blast injury no one ever officially recorded. He gave the porch a long look. Before stepping through the gate, careful not to disturb the crushed roses beneath it, Eleanor opened the door without a word. She'd already set out 2 cups of coffee. "Still the same porch paint," he said as he sat. "You're still late," she replied. He smiled with the corner of his mouth that still worked properly. Only by 27 years. By mid-morning, the second had arrived. A woman this time, shorter than the rest, remembered her, but with the same hard-set jaw and the gait of someone who had carried more weight than her frame should have allowed. Loretta Laurie Chen had been a cipher specialist back in Berlin. Fast hands, faster mind. She wore gardening gloves when she stepped onto the porch, a nod to the cover life she'd been maintaining in Nevada for the past 2 decades. She kissed Eleanor on the cheek, no words exchanged, and placed a small metal tin on the table. Rhodes glanced inside after she sat. Microchips, a folded document, a single capsule in a cotton swab tube. "You kept it all?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "Of course I did," she said flatly. She told us to. Around noon came Ellis, still broad-shouldered, still wearing the same aviator sunglasses he'd worn in every surveillance photo from 1978 to 1983. His left leg dragged slightly, the result of a fall from a train roof in Warsaw. He carried a battered thermos and a canvas bag that looked military issue, though the markings had long since faded. Eleanor watched from the porch as he approached. He gave a single two-finger salute from the brow, the old gesture, the steps. "I heard the signal," he said, breathless from the hill. "Was hoping it was a mistake." "It's never a mistake," she answered. He poured black coffee into a cup and added nothing. The fourth came last, quietest of the group. Didn't speak until spoken to, and even then, only when necessary. Number 1 remembered his real name. They called him Shepherd. He wore a gray cap pulled low, and when he arrived, he didn't approach the house right away. Instead, he walked the perimeter of the property, slow and deliberate, as if reacquainting himself with the terrain. When he finally made his way to the porch, his hands were tucked into his coat pockets, and his eyes scanned every window, every bush, every corner. "Perimeter's clean," he said. Eleanor handed him a plate of shortbread cookies without a word. By early afternoon, the six of them sat on the porch in near silence, sipping coffee and listening to the slow stirrings of Redstone Hollow. The hum of a lawnmower 2 blocks over, the distant bark of a dog, a child's laughter, somewhere too far to reach. They didn't speak of what Unit 27 had done, not aloud, not in this town. Their operations had never been named in reports, never, etched into medals or journals. They existed in the margins between embassies, between wars, between lies told for the sake of peace. But they remembered. Each of them carried pieces of the old machine in their posture, in their glances, in their habits. Rhodes stood by the steps, arms crossed, watching them settle into place. He hadn't been one of them. He had been trained by them. "Know why we're here?" he said quietly. Ellis took a long sip from his thermos. She made the call. "And we answer," Shepherd said. Eleanor looked out at her ruined garden, then back to the table where the folder sat, opened again to the first page. "No one ruins what we built," she said, "not without finding out what we left behind." And the ghosts of Unit 27 nodded. When new recruits joined the program, they didn't meet Eleanor Mayfield right away. At first, they were just handed a manila folder stamped with a red line and a numerical designation, 27. No explanation, no insignia, only the note, "Follow. Orders disregard, rank. Your instructor will be watching before you see her." And she always was in the early days, back when the unit was still unofficial. Just an experimental cell, buried in a budget line under something called Civic Stability Operations. Eleanor operated from behind mirrored glass and locked doors. She studied how they moved, how they blinked under stress, how their hands twitched when asked to lie about something they believed. The instructors who came before her taught tactics. Eleanor taught intention by the 3rd week of training. Most of the unit had heard rumors that the voice behind the intercom correcting their posture, their breathing, their disinformation drills belonged to someone not listed on the personnel chart. A woman, they guessed, by the cadence, soft but deliberate. Each word chosen like a scalpel. Rhodes had joined much later, when Unit 27 was already in deep rotation across field sites places the maps didn't name, and the stories never reached. But even then, everyone still referred to her the same way, the widow, not because she had lost someone, but because she made others lose things: secrets, certainty, command. She could dismantle your conviction with a single sentence. Not by yelling, but by asking the one question you hadn't considered. Now, in the house with the rocking chair and the shattered flower beds, the people she trained sat quietly in the room she had built for watching. Loretta reached into her jacket and pulled out a creased photo. The image was grainy, almost obscured by age. 6 figures in mismatched fatigues stood in a concrete courtyard. One was Eleanor, barely 30, hair pulled back, wearing a sidearm like it belonged on her. Her posture was unmistakable. She wasn't part of the group. She was the one it orbited. "She made us run scenarios blindfolded," Loretta said softly, 12 hours at a time. "No food, no sleep, just voices in our ears, and puzzles we had to solve before the floor dropped out beneath us." Double quotes. Ellis nodded slowly, gazing at the photograph. "I saw her convince a captured informant to turn on His handler, in under 10 minutes, didn't touch him, didn't threaten him, just asked him 3 questions in the right order. "Madrid?" Rhodes asked. "Albania," Ellis said. "The handler was ours. Didn't even realize it until she handed me the tape." Shepard didn't speak. He just pulled back the sleeve of his coat and tapped the small scar near his elbow. 3 dots in a perfect line, a marker only members of Unit 27 carried. Eleanor had never required it, but the first generation of recruits had done it anyway. Not out of loyalty, out of understanding. She didn't ask for devotion. She taught them to question everything, including her. It wasn't until decades later that Rhodes learned Eleanor had designed the original psychological assessment tools, now standard in covert fieldwork tools, used to predict not just how people act, but how they unravel. She had written entire doctrine papers under pseudonyms for agencies that claimed to have no record of her, but to the 6 in that room. None of that needed repeating, because what Madrid wasn't what she did. It was how she made them ready for what others wouldn't see coming. "She told us once," Loretta said, setting the photo gently on the table, "that silence can do more than a bullet. If you make someone fill the silence with their own fear, they'll turn themselves inside out trying to escape it." Rhodes looked at Eleanor, who had said nothing this whole time. She was seated at the window now, watching the street, the horizon, the place where town ended and woods began. "Trained us all," he said quietly, and still, even now, she was watching. The garden shed at the edge of Eleanor's backyard had never drawn much attention. It looked like any other structure of its kind, sun-bleached moss on the shingles, a wooden door that stuck in the summer heat. Children who passed by during their walks to school thought of it as an old lady's potting shed, maybe filled with dusty trowels and seed packets and the odd spider hanging in a forgotten corner. Even those who had peeked inside only saw gardening gloves, burlap sacks, and a row of empty terracotta pots on a warped shelf. It was, by all appearances, just that, but at midnight, the shed changed under cover of darkness and the high-frequency hum of crickets. The back wall of the shed swung inward, revealing a reinforced panel disguised behind hanging garden tools. Inside was a narrow stairwell leading 5 steps down into compacted earth. No light spilled out unless switched manually. At the bottom was a concrete floor, smooth and silent, with a rectangular room barely wider than the shed above Eleanor. "Step down first." Her movements deliberate but unhesitating, Rhodes followed, carrying a small case that bore no labels and made no sound when it moved. Behind them, Loretta reached up to pull the string hanging from the ceiling. The wall swung shut with a muted click. The air inside the room was cool, dense, faintly metallic. Along the left wall stood an aging metal rack stacked with equipment boxes, panels, cables coiled into perfect loops, a switchboard with no labels. A gray monitor the size of a dictionary hummed to life with a single push of a toggle. Rhodes moved to the far corner where a workbench had been cleared. He opened the case and removed a pair of small uplink antennas. Attaching one to the existing satellite relay embedded in the concrete ceiling, in the center of the room sat a table with a large blueprint spread across it. The paper was yellowed at the edges, but the ink remained clear. It was a layout of Redstone Hollow, overlaid with red grid lines and numbered zones. Not just streets and buildings, but underground junctions, fiber optic nodes, obsolete gas lines, storm drain access points, and former Cold War civil defense shelters marked in faded green. Loretta moved toward a cabinet and opened it. Inside was a rotary phone mounted to a steel panel, its black receiver resting against a cradle, polished smooth from decades of use. She didn't touch it. Not yet. Shepard entered last, carrying 2 small signal interceptors and a packet of weathered index cards. He placed them near the monitor and nodded to Rhodes. "Scanners up, pulling airwave traffic now. Clean so far." Rhodes adjusted the dials until the monitor displayed a live frequency map, each spike a different layer of electromagnetic noise. He traced a fingertip across the screen. "They're still local, minimal chatter. No, Jamaretha, they don't have one, or they're too confident to bother." Eleanor remained standing, one hand lightly on the back of a chair. She was studying the blueprint again. Her eyes traced paths she had memorized decades earlier, each red circle a contingency, each annotation a whisper from her past self. She tapped a location near the southwest quadrant of town. "They're bunking at the tavern for now," she said, "but this is where they'll go when things get loud." Rhodes followed her finger. "The old rail yard they'll want. A fallback with clear exits and no cameras. It's the only place that gives them both." She turned to the others, the weight of her silence shaping their stillness. "Once we light up the uplink, they'll know someone's watching. We don't tip the scale until we're ready to end it." Ellis stepped in, carrying a coffee thermos and a radio unit that looked like it had been salvaged from a submarine. "Who's on the other end of the phone?" he asked, nodding toward the rotary. Eleanor walked over, her hand resting gently on the receiver. "Whoever still remembers how to listen." No one laughed. No one asked for more detail. At 12:17 a.m., Loretta flipped the main switch on the uplink. The overhead light dimmed for a moment, then stabilized. A soft pulse echoed through the concrete as the signal locked to a passing satellite. The command center was live, and the quiet war in Redstone Hollow had officially begun. The photo was grainy, printed from an inkjet long past its prime, the kind that left faint lines across anything more detailed than a headshot. But the face was still visible: sharp jaw, smirking mouth, and eyes hidden behind a pair of dark aviators. Rhodes held the image in his hand as if weighing its history. The man in the picture stood beside a younger version of himself, Phileno's grandson, Thomas Mayfield. Thomas had been 27 when he disappeared, a civil engineering graduate with quiet confidence and a head full of blueprints. He'd returned to Redstone Hollow after college, not because he missed the town, but because he wanted to fix it. He took a job surveying old county properties, records management, inspection, the kind of work that left most people numb with bureaucracy, but not Thomas B. He had a mind for patterns, and more importantly, he noticed when things didn't add up. Eleanor hadn't spoken much about him, even to Rhodes, but his name sat at the top of the list in the folder marked Operation Garden Vow. Under a section labeled Compromised Assets, External, he found something in the zoning records, Rhodes said, setting the photo down on the blueprint table. Money trails, dead permits for buildings that never existed, warehouses purchased by shell companies, all under the same approving signature. Sheriff Nolan, Loretta said flatly, as she scanned a column of faded notes. Rhodes nodded. That's the name Thomas circled in his report. He filed a complaint. 2 weeks later, his apartment was broken into. Nothing stolen, just his computer wiped and a burner phone left on the table with no battery. Ellis leaned back, folding his arms. And no official report on the break-in. None that made it past county, Rhodes replied. But Eleanor kept everything drive backups, audio notes. Even the list of names Thomas passed to her the day before he vanished. Shepard stepped forward and placed a newer photo beside the older one. It had been taken just days ago, captured from surveillance outside the tavern. The smirk was the same. So was the jaw. Same glasses. A little older, but unmistakable Deke, he said. Same guy, Rhodes confirmed. Name's different. Now goes by Deacon, no last name. Local sheriff's office doesn't touch him. They claim he's not affiliated with any known club. But every time there's a missing persons case within 30 miles, he's somewhere nearby. Eleanor remained quiet. She stood at the window of the command shed, staring past her reflection into the dark, unmoving garden. He followed Thomas, she said finally. It started with barroom questions. Then, shadowing his car, Thomas called me one night, said someone had left a flyer under his windshield with a single word printed on it. Stop. He didn't say anything else. Just asked if the back gate was still rigged like I taught him. Her voice was steady, no tremor. But her knuckles had turned white around the edge of the table. 3 days later, Rhodes continued. Thomas was gone. No sign of a struggle. No note. His last signal pinged at the edge of the Cormac Woods. Then nothing. Shepard narrowed his eyes. That's just beyond the rail yard. Exactly, said Rhodes. Loretta reached into the folder and pulled out another Idaman envelope. Unsealed, addressed only to EM, inside was a single flash drive. She inserted it into the encrypted laptop and pulled up a folder labeled Pattern 9 Nolan Network. Dozens of files loaded, maps, receipts, property transfers. A web of relationships leading from Redstone Hollow, outward contractors, bikers, shell companies, and political donations stretching into neighboring counties. At the center of the map, Sheriff Nolan, and just beneath him, in smaller type Deacon, alias Deke, last confirmed associate of an unregistered enforcement crew believed to operate under private direction. No legal footprint, no official records, just shadows. Rhodes looked at Eleanor. He didn't just harass Thomas, he silenced him. Eleanor turned from the window, eyes fixed with the quiet fire of a woman who no longer had room for mercy. "We'll remind him," she said, "who trained the boy he tried to break." And no one in the room questioned what would come next. The clink of porcelain echoed through the kitchen as Eleanor carefully lifted each teacup from its place in the glass front cabinet. Her movements were slow but sure, not from age but from finality. She set each one down on the counter with a kind of reverence delicate floral china collected over decades, pieces that had seen laughter, grief, anniversaries, and Sunday mornings with neighbors long since buried. They had survived storms, power outages, and the ache of widowhood, but they would not survive what was coming. One by one, she wrapped them in linen towels and tucked them into a cardboard box marked with a bold black X. Rhodes stood by the doorway, silent, watching her. He knew what this meant. The tea set had always been Eleanor's shield, her way of softening what had been hard, of creating the illusion of domesticity when the past pressed in too close. When the last saucer was packed away, she reached to the top shelf, where a thin layer of dust had gathered. There, resting behind a row of faded recipe cards, was a key, small, brass, worn smooth on the edges. She took it down without hesitation. She walked to the hall closet, reached behind a stack of wool coats that hadn't been worn in years, and pulled out a small wooden chest. It was unremarkable at first glance. Scuffed edges, rust along the hinges, but the box carried weight, literal and otherwise. Stamped across the top, in faded red stencil, were the words, "In case they ever come back." Eleanor placed the box on the kitchen table with a sound that made everyone in the house look up. Loretta entered first, drying, her hands with a dish towel that she instinctively folded and set down beside the sugar jar. Ellis followed, wiping sweat from his brow. He'd been reinforcing the shed's doorframe just in case. Shepard lingered in the hallway until the box opened. He never liked to be too close to anything that whispered about the past. Eleanor inserted the key, turned it with a soft click, and lifted the lid. Inside, neatly packed in cotton and oilcloth, were items none of them had seen in years. At the top was a photograph, black and white, showing 6 operatives standing in front of a radio van somewhere in the Balkans. Eleanor was in the center, looking down at a map. Behind that was a bundle of letters, ciphered notes written by Thomas in the months before he vanished, each one encoded in a substitution pattern Eleanor had taught him as a child. Hidden inside recipes and garden diagrams, Rhodes picked up a small black pouch and opened it, revealing 3 antique tools, a miniature transmitter spoofer, a pair of tension wrenches, and a thumb-sized device that looked like a hearing aid but wasn't. These were banned 2 decades ago, he said. "I know," Eleanor replied. "That's why I kept them." Further down, nestled between cloth rolls, was something heavier. A sidearm, not government-issue civilian, modified with a shortened barrel and a custom ivory. Grip, no serial number. She wrapped her fingers around it, tested the balance, and nodded. She set it aside. Then came the final piece of notebook, thick with entries, none labeled. Loretta opened to the middle and scanned a page. "These are predictions," she said slowly. "Timelines, contingencies, even notes on the sheriff." "I knew the moment they found Thomas," Eleanor said, "not by confirmation, but by what didn't happen next." She tapped the blank space on a page where Thomas's next entry should have been. "They took my grandson," she continued, "because he stood for something this town wasn't ready to remember. But I taught him to leave a trail. Not a breadcrumb trail for rescue, but a fire line, something that would ignite when stepped on." She shut the box. No more tea and tolerance. If they want to bring their noise, their threats, their arrogance to my door. She looked around the room, meeting each gaze. Then they'll learn what quiet people do when pushed too far. And the room, once filled with the softness of tradition and the scent of chamomile, now thrummed with something else, readiness. The contents of the box didn't shimmer or hum. They didn't glow or give off any scent that would betray their purpose. But to those who had been trained to read more than appearances, it was clear that this wasn't just a collection of old Fieldgurrit was Eleanor's contingency plan, assembled one piece at a time over the course of decades. Hidden in plain sight among the trappings of widowhood and small-town routine, Rhodes reached in and lifted a pair of garden gloves. At first glance, they looked ordinary soft leather palms, faded floral print, a few spots of dirt still clinging to the fingertips. But when he turned them inside out, thin metallic threading became visible along the seams. Integrated capacitive contacts, designed to control sensors or set off remote triggers with the flex of a finger. Still functional, he muttered, placing them gently on the table. Next came a row of what looked like ornamental garden stakes painted to resemble small daisies, their petals chipped from age. Eleanor picked one up, twisting the base until a quiet click released a concealed lens. The flower head popped off, revealing a camera barely larger than a raisin. "I used to stick these around the edge of the garden," she said. "People assumed I was just decorating. I wasn't." Loretta examined one and nodded. Thermal and Wodongle, probably linked to the relay node buried under the fence line. Old tech, but effective. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in oilcloth and carefully padded with wads of wool, lay a thin gray strip about the length of a ruler. It was bent slightly, its surface dull, its edges rough. But anyone who had served in the field knew exactly what it was: military-grade plastic explosive. Rhodes picked it up with both hands, carefully. "See for derivative?" he asked. "Not quite," Eleanor replied. "It's newer. Composition N9, stolen off a contractor. Pallet in '98. I had a friend smuggle it inside an antique bird feeder." She gestured toward the window. "That one, Shepherd." Approached and leaned down to inspect the strip. He tapped the edge gently, nodding. "Stable," he said, "still viable with the right ignition." Loretta tilted her head. "How did you manage to hold on to this without setting off a dozen red flags?" Eleanor gave a dry smile. "I labeled it Tensile Plant Support in the garden ledger. No one in Redstone ever questioned my botany records. They turned." Back to the rest of the box. A field radio, no battery, just a crank charger, each notch on the dial marked not with numbers, but coordinates. A small toolkit nestled in foam, each piece engraved with a symbol rather than a name. A pocket mirror with 3 reflective panels, standard issue for signal operations before satellites became dominant. And in a shallow side compartment, a child's necklace made of painted pasta and twine. Rhodes held it up, confused. "What's this?" Eleanor took it gently from his hand. "Thomas made it for me when he was 6. Said the colors matched the snapdragons. I wore it every spring, until he left for school." Loretta looked at her, then at the box. It was a trigger. Eleanor nodded slowly. The garden stakes weren't always powered, but if the necklace passed within 3 feet of the border sensor, it activated the transmitters for 6 hours. That way, if anything ever happened to me, he could still be heard. Rhodes finished. Eleanor folded the necklace back into the box and shut the lid softly. The quiet inside the kitchen was no longer passive. It was the kind of quiet that waits, not empty, but full, like the pause before a clock strikes or the split second before a switch is flipped outside. The garden looked like it always had: neatly tended rows, patches of disturbed earth where plants had once bloomed. The remnants of crushed petals carried by the wind, but beneath it now, daisy heads blinked unseen. Pressure sensors nestled in soil. Motion relays disguised as decorative rocks, a perimeter not made of pickets, but of memory and intent. And when Rhodes glanced once more at the box, then at Eleanor, he understood. This wasn't about destruction, it was about being ready. They arrived on a Thursday morning, just after the diner's first shift and before the high school bell rang. 3 men in flannel shirts, mud-stained boots, and hard hats stepped out of a white work van with a rusted bumper and magnetic decals that read Henderson Utility and Cable Region 4. The van didn't look new, and the men didn't look in a hurry. One sipped coffee from a thermos as he uncoiled fiber optic cable from a reel. Another walked the sidewalk with a clipboard, occasionally squatting to examine what appeared to be a junction box dot to the residents of Redstone Hollow. They were forgettable contractors. From somewhere else, hired to do some kind of upgrade or replacement, people barely looked twice. That was the point inside the Mayfield house. Rhodes was watching from the front window with binoculars. Eleanor had used for birdwatching since the Midatis. He tracked their movements silently, ticking off each gesture in his mind. The first man made 3 loops around the power box before kneeling in a particular stance, left foot angled back, head slightly turned, a sign. The second tapped the clipboard twice before removing a pen from behind his ear with his left hand. Another sign, "They're ours," Rhodes said. All 3. Eleanor didn't look up. She was slicing apples at the kitchen counter. Rhythm even, and unhurried names. Michael Thorne, Jonah Bell, and Felix Dent. Last known assignment, Jakarta Civil Infrastructure Security Sweep. After the embassy incident, I thought 2 of them had retired. They did, Eleanor said, but not from me. The third, Mayfield, get knocked on the Mayfield gate around noon. He carried a spool of wire under one arm and wore a laminated badge that said Field Supervisor. Eleanor opened the door without asking who it was. "Ma'am," he greeted, voice calm but clipped. "Come inside," she answered. He stepped over the threshold and removed his cap. The lines around his eyes were deeper now, but the sharpness hadn't left him. His movements were quiet, practiced like a man always calculating exits. Jonah's parked by the southern drain tunnel. Mike's already started a false cable pull to explain the sidewalk cuts. "You brought the scrambler?" Eleanor asked. Felix reached into his coat and produced a small black device the size of a deck of cards. Field strength's adjustable. To a 10-meter radius, won't knock out cell service, but it'll corrupt audio and prevent drone pickups. She gave a curt nod and placed it beside the rotary phone on the table. Rhodes came in from the hallway, arms folded. "I've read their files. You handpicked these 3. They were my final class," Eleanor said. "When the unit was disbanded, I made them promise one thing. If I ever called, they wouldn't ask why." Felix took a seat at the dining room table, looking at the floral tablecloth like it was a blueprint. "This Deacon guy, he's ex-military, private security," Rhodes said. "Maybe trained, but sloppy. Relies on intimidation, not precision. He doesn't expect pushback, because no one in this town remembers who Eleanor really is." Felix nodded. "Then he's already lost." Outside, the other 2 men worked in plain view, laying cables, marking chalk lines on the sidewalk, tapping metal rods into the earth. But their gear wasn't connected to anything. The cables were hollow, filled with fiber sheaths meant to house micro cameras. The chalk marked access points, not utilities. They weren't there to fix anything. They were building a perimeter one the town wouldn't notice until it was too late. Jonah, crouched near the corner hydrant, looked up and gave a short whistle 2 notes. Felix tapped the side of his watch. "He's in position," he said. "We'll have a live feed by nightfall." Eleanor placed the apple slices into a tin and covered it with wax paper. "Give these to the pastor's wife when you finish. She'll assume you're just kind laborers. That's important." Felix took the tin without question. "Understood." As he left, he paused in the doorway. "You still remember how to run the silent command protocol?" Eleanor met his eyes. "I wrote it." He smiled, brief and real. "It's good to be back." When the door closed behind him, Rhodes turned to Eleanor. "Did you ever doubt they'd come?" "Not once," she said. "I didn't train them to forget." The streets of Redstone Hollow were still as stone. A fog had rolled in from the hills around midnight, settling into the gutters and pressing against porch lights with a thick, cotton-like quiet. Most windows were dark. The town had long since gone to sleep except for the tavern, where the bikers had passed out one by one beneath neon signs and half-empty pitchers. Their laughter had faded hours ago, replaced by the low drone of an old jukebox set to random shuffle, now playing too. No one in particular. Across the street a van sat with its lights off. No decals this time. Its rear doors opened slowly, and 3 figures emerged. Each wore soft-soled boots and matte black gloves. No words were exchanged. The team had rehearsed this type of operation countless times, though never in a place this quiet, never in a town so familiar. Michael approached the first motorcycle with a small canvas roll slung across his chest. Inside were a dozen tools, each one nestled in its own compartment, gleaming faintly under the dull moonlight. He knelt, brushing dirt from the license plate with a gloved thumb. His eyes tracked the connections between the handlebars, the ignition, housing, and the undercarriage. He had done this before, only this time. It wasn't to sabotage, it was to study. He removed the seat first, for silent screws. Beneath it, the wiring harness was exactly where he expected. He clipped a single green wire, not enough to prevent the engine from starting, but enough to reroute power when needed. Into the space between wires, he slid a device smaller than a matchbox, secured it with a magnetic clip, then pressed a thumb against its side. It pulsed once barely visible. Jonah moved along the second row of bikes. His task wasn't placement, but calibration. For every beacon installed, he entered a corresponding code into a tablet connected to a remote Uplinken Old Combs Tower east of town that had been dormant for years, reactivated just the night before. Each entry was silent, methodical. The devices wouldn't transmit constantly, only when in motion, and only on a frequency buried beneath commercial radio bands. Felix circled the perimeter with a compact scanner, watching for any signs of electronic countermeasures. He found none. The bikers had no digital defenses, no signal jammers, no early warning systems. They were operating under the assumption that intimidation was its own shield. They hadn't considered the possibility of someone watching them with more discipline than they'd ever known. By 3:16 a.m., every motorcycle 11 in total had been opened, adjusted, resealed, and returned to its exact position. Each ignition would still turn over with a familiar growl. Each headlight would still flicker on, but from now on, every time they moved, they would send a signal to the relay hub under Eleanor's garden. A signal that would triangulate position, velocity, and heading. The town would never be caught off guard again. Felix tapped the side of his earpiece. All clear. Michael closed the tool roll and stood, brushing dust from his knees. Leave their pride intact. That's part of the message. They won't know they've been touched, Jonah said, slipping the tablet back into a case. Until they realized someone knew how to touch them without making a sound. Back in the van, they filed in without a word. The doors closed with a whisper. The engine didn't start until they were 5 blocks away, and even then, it didn't rev. Just a slow glide into the mist inside the shed. Rhodes was watching the signal map on the monitor. One by one, the markers began to blink. He smiled. Without amusement, fish on the line, he said. Eleanor didn't look up from the notebook in her lap. Let them think they're still in control. That's where the real fear begins. She turned the page. The next phase was already written. It was still dark when Eleanor stepped out onto her porch, the sky bruised with the faintest blue along the horizon. She didn't wear black, she didn't wear anything dramatic, just her usual cardigan, the one with the worn cuffs, and the same gray skirt she'd gardened in 4 years. In her hands she carried a single terracotta pot. It wasn't new. The rim was chipped, and a crack ran like a vein down one side, sealed with an old patch of resin. But what grew inside it was fresh marigolds, thick and bright, their orange and gold blooms dense like fire trapped in petals. She walked slowly, not with hesitation, but care. Each step measured, as though she was delivering something sacred. Rhodes offered to drive her. She declined. The walk to the tavern was only 4 blocks, and she knew every crack in the sidewalk, every maple tree, every lamppost. Redstone Hollow might have changed its buildings and buried its memories, but Eleanor had not. She passed the bakery. Dark inside, past the library, where the lights glowed faintly from a desk lamp someone had left on overnight. At the corner, she paused and listened. A single car passed in the distance. A nightbird called out once and then fell silent. She kept walking. The tavern loomed at the far end of Main Street, its windows covered in old band flyers and the ghost of neon reflections. The bikes still lined the front like sentries, silent and gleaming, unaware they had already been compromised. No one stirred inside. The hour between bar close and dawn belonged to no one. She stopped at the top of the steps. Adjusting the pot in her hands, the marigolds swayed slightly in the breeze. Then she crouched it, slowly, but deliberately, and placed the pot on the stoop just to the right of the entrance, where every boot would pass. She reached into her coat pocket and removed a small brass tool, no bigger than a thimble, and gently scraped away the top layer of soil. Beneath the petals, she began to arrange small, flat stones, each no larger than a button. 5 minutes passed, then 10. When she was done, she stood and brushed her palms together. The stones sat against the black soil and ringed with marigold. Roots spelled out a message in blocky, unmistakable precision. Leave or be unrooted. There was no signature, no symbol, just those words, quiet, firm, and final. She turned and walked back the way she came. She didn't look over her shoulder. Behind her, the marigolds caught the first weak glow of the morning sun, their edges turning gold. They looked beautiful, but they weren't meant to comfort. They were a warning. At 6:43 a.m., the bartender arrived for his shift early, rubbing sleep from his eyes and yawning as he approached the door. He noticed the pot first, then leaned down to read the stones. His breath hitched. He didn't touch the message, just stepped backwards slowly and pulled out his phone. By 7:12 a.m., 3 of the bikers were awake. They gathered around the pot, arguing whether it was a prank or a threat. One of them, Deacon, didn't speak. He crouched beside the marigolds, staring hard, then stood and walked back inside. At 7:34 a.m., Felix parked across the street in an unmarked utility van, snapped a photo through the windshield, and sent it to Rhodes. The reply came immediately. She's not bluffing. In the Mayfield house, Eleanor returned the brass tool to its drawer and made a cup of tea. She didn't need to see their faces. She knew how they would react, confused first, then amused, then uneasy, then afraid. That's how you teach a lesson. Without raising your voice, that's how you plant fear. Not with shouts, not with sirens, but with flowers. Sheriff Blake Harlan parked his cruiser just beyond the tavern, angling it slightly to block view from the coffee shop across the street. The sun was up now, hanging low and hard-edged above the rooftops of Redstone Hollow. Already, word had spread about the marigolds on the tavern stoop. By the time Harlan got the call, half the town had already walked past it, snapped photos, and drawn their own conclusions. He stepped out of the car and adjusted the brim of his hat. At 50, his knees ached when he stood too fast, and the scar on his left shoulder twinged when the air was cold. This morning, it was cold. He glanced at the pot from a distance before stepping closer, squinting at the soil. The words were still there, clear as print, arranged in deliberate stone: leave or be unrooted. One of the tavern staff, a kid, no older than 20, came out and started to speak. Harlan held up a hand. "Don't touch it," he said, "but don't touch it." The kid backed up, and Harlan crouched. He stared at the message longer than he needed to, not because he couldn't read it, but because he was remembering something else. Another message. Written in chalk on a cobblestone wall in Berlin in the spring of 1963, it had been raining. The wall had been crumbling, and the woman who'd left it hadn't said a word, just walked away in her long coat, disappearing into the fog like she belonged to it. He stood slowly, dusting his hands against his thighs. Behind him, the bikers had started to gather, half-dressed, bleary-eyed, some of them still nursing hangovers. Deacon stood at the center, arms folded, mouth flat. "You gonna do something about this?" Deacon asked. Harlan turned slowly to face him. "About what?" Deacon gestured to the pot. "It's a threat. Some old lady thinks she's gonna scare us off with flowers." Harlan looked him over. "That's so? You don't think it's suspicious?" Deacon pressed. "You don't think someone needs to answer for that?" "I think," Harlan said carefully, "you parked your bikes all over private property, disturbed half a town with your noise, and now you're upset that someone had something to say about it." Deacon scoffed. "So what you're taking?" "Her side." "I'm not taking sides," Harlan replied. "I'm making observations." He turned and walked back to his cruiser, scribbling something in a small notepad. The bikers watched him, unsatisfied. Deacon called after him. "She's no one, just a widow with too much time on her hands." Harlan stopped at the car door. "You think that's all she is?" Deacon didn't respond. The sheriff got in the car and sat there for a long moment. The photo was still in his mind, taken in a dusty alley near Checkpoint Charlie. 6 figures. One woman, her face turned slightly, her expression calm in a way that unsettled even back then. He'd been a junior operative then, barely trusted with field notes. She'd been something else, something above his clearance level. But he remembered her eyes, and he remembered what happened 2 days after that message appeared in Berlin. A warehouse fire, a diplomat removed quietly from East Germany. A chain of events that shifted things in ways the history books never recorded. Asked just once who that woman had been, his superior had replied without hesitation. "Her name is Eleanor Mayfield. If you ever see her again, pretend you didn't." Back in Redstone Hollow, Harlan tore the page from his notepad and folded it into the glove compartment. Then he started the engine and drove off past the flower stand where Eleanor used to sell snapdragons, past the churchyard where her husband was buried, past the front porch where she now sat quietly sipping her tea dot as he passed the Mayfield house. He did not wave, he did not nod, but he did tip his hat barely, almost invisibly, because he still remembered her eyes, and he knew what they meant. He came just after noon, his shadow falling long across Eleanor's walkway. Cody wasn't like the others. He didn't swagger, he didn't rev an engine, or spit sunflower seeds onto her grass. He came alone, helmet in hand, walking his bike. Rather than riding it, the wheels crunching softly over the gravel as if he didn't want to startle anything. Least of all her Dot, Eleanor saw him from the window and didn't move. She watched him stop at the edge of her property, hesitating near the white picket gate that had been freshly repainted 2 weeks before the incident. His jacket was too big for him, patched with logos that didn't match his age. The others had worn theirs like armor, he wore his like a borrowed name. He looked toward the porch. She didn't speak. Eventually, he stepped forward and lifted the gate latch, slow and deliberate. It didn't creak. Rhodes had oiled it the night before. When he reached the top step, he stopped and held the helmet against his chest like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. He didn't sit. He didn't speak right away. Eleanor watched him for a long time, the silence between them thick with the weight of whatever he carried. Finally, he said, "I didn't laugh." She didn't blink. "I didn't throw the cans. I didn't ride over your flowers. I tried to stop them, but they said if I didn't go along, I was out." She studied his face. Not the words faces always told more. His eyes were rimmed with guilt, not fear. His voice wasn't rehearsed. "They don't know I came." He added, Eleanor nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Come here to ask you to forgive them. Or me. I just." He looked down at his boots. "I saw what they did, and I thought about my grandmother. She died last winter. She used to grow tomatoes in old paint buckets behind the trailer. She would have cried if someone did what they did to you." Eleanor's eyes softened, just slightly. At that, Cody stepped forward and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. She tensed, barely a flicker in her fingers, but what he pulled out was nothing more than a small envelope, creased from being carried too long. He set it gently on the table beside her rocking chair. "It's not much," he said, "just $20. My share of the gas money they made me pitch in. I figured if it helped replace even one plant." Eleanor didn't pick up the envelope. She didn't touch it. Cody nodded, accepting that silence might be all he'd get. "I'll go," he said quietly. He turned. But before he reached the gate, she spoke. "What's your name?" He stopped mid-step and turned back. "Cody. How old are you?" 19. She tilted her head. "You any good with your hands, Cody?" He shrugged. "I've helped my uncle rewire trailers, fixed a few engines. I can follow directions." She stood then, not quickly, but with a steadiness that made him straighten. She walked past him without another word and motioned to the side yard, where a row of broken trellises leaned in awkward angles. "If you want to make things right," she said, "start there. The garden's not going to replant itself." Cody blinked. "You want me to help? I want you to earn the apology you came to give." He didn't move at first. Then he looked toward the trellises and back at her, and he nodded. She handed him a pair of gloves, too big, the leather worn down at the fingertips. "They're not new," she said. "I'm not either," he replied. She almost smiled. As he walked toward the trellises, she returned to her chair. The envelope remained on the table beside her, unopened. She would never spend the money. But the decision to come back, to stand alone when the others hadn't meant something more than the $20 ever could. Some people needed consequences. Others needed a door left slightly ajar, and Eleanor, though not forgiving, understood the difference. It started with a flicker. One moment the lights buzzed above Redstone Hollow's quiet streets, and the next, the entire town dropped into silence. Street lamps blinked once, then faded. Neon signs in the tavern windows sputtered and vanished. Homes dimmed, radios died mid-song, and the steady hum of the town's only traffic light fell still. In less than 10 seconds, everything outside Eleanor's gate had gone dark, except her house from the back porch. Eleanor sat with her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, a cup of chamomile resting on the railing beside her. Her porch light glowed a steady amber, casting soft rings across the wooden floorboards. Inside, the Mayfield home buzzed with quiet, uninterrupted current. The overhead lights in the kitchen, the signal monitors in the garden shed, even the rotary phones, tiny indicator bull ball untouched. Eleanor didn't react to the blackout. She didn't rise or call out. She just sipped her tea, eyes fixed. On the faint outlines of Main Street below, it was not the darkness that interested her, but what always followed it. From where she sat, she could make out the shapes of people emerging from houses, some with flashlights, others with phones, raised high, searching for service. A few car alarms began to wail, triggered not by impact, but by the sudden surge and loss of electrical flow. The tavern door slammed open, spilling laughter and confusion onto the sidewalk. The bikers poured out, voices raised in irritation, some assuming it was a town-wide grid issue, others shouting about sabotage. One of them kicked the tavern doorframe in frustration. Another hurled a beer bottle into the street, the crash echoing too loud in the sudden stillness. Deacon stood in the center of them, arms crossed, trying to assess which direction the blame should point. Inside Eleanor's shed, 3 monitors lit the darkness. Felix watched camera feeds from the utility poles. Jonah monitored the relay input from the rooftop antenna. Rhodes stood with arms folded, listening to the rhythm of generator noise humming through a low-frequency loop. Their faces were calm. "Signal disruptions complete," Jonah said. "Town's main breaker tripped by remote should look like an accidental surge to anyone who checks the logs." Felix nodded. Backup grid at the hospital kicked in. That's the only other site still lit. "Good," Rhodes said, then glanced toward the porch. "Has she moved?" Felix tapped a key, switching the camera to infrared. Eleanor's heat signature was still there, motionless, serene. "No," he replied, "she's watching." And she was. She saw the patterns she remembered from other places, other nights. The way fear spread, not like fire, but like fog. People didn't panic right away. They looked around first, waited, assumed someone else would act. But as minutes passed and no solution appeared, that comfort dissolved. Noise grew, small conflict sparked. Blame drifted like pollen. It was never about the darkness itself. It was about the realization that no one was in control. From the hill behind her house, 2 lights flickered, not flashlight signals. A short blink, followed by 3 long bursts. A pattern. Rhodes stepped out onto the porch, confirming the sequence. Then he turned to Eleanor. "Alpha Zone confirms readiness." She nodded once dawn in town. The bikers had begun to spread out. A few marched toward the power station, assuming sabotage. 2 tried to start their motorcycles. The engine sputtered once, then stalled internal diagnostics, hijacked by the tracking beacons. Silent and untraceable dot, Eleanor stood, slowly, and walked to the edge of the porch. Her tea remained untouched on the railing. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The night was saying everything for her. Every broken current, every missed signal, every light that refused to return it, all spoke to a design they couldn't see. "Not yet," she turned to Rhodes. "They'll start to understand soon." He nodded. "And when they do," she looked back at the town, quiet and fractured in the dark. "They'll realize they've already lost." Inside the shed behind Eleanor's house, the air was thick with the low hum of machinery and the faint scent of cedar. A single desk lamp cast golden light over the rough blueprints taped to the wall, and the folders spread across the old potting. Tabled Rhodes stood at the head of the room, hands behind his back, while Felix and Jonah leaned over the plans. Each of them marked with decades of experience that didn't show in their age, but in their calm. They didn't speak until Rhodes did. "This isn't about getting even," he said, voice low, clipped. "This is about ensuring they don't do to anyone else what they thought they could get away with here." Eleanor sat at the far end of the room, notebook open, glasses low on her nose. She didn't interrupt. This part she had taught them to do on their own, to think wider than the wound, to strike not just the blade, but the hand that held it. Rhodes stepped to the wall and pointed to a set of photographs pinned alongside. A map, faces, names, timestamps. They call themselves the Cobras now. They're not just a bar gang, they're a network. Patchins in 3 states, meth running in 2, illegal weapons in 1. They're small-time muscle for mid-level money. Jonah, nodded. We cross-referenced the plates from their bikes with VIN data. 4 are stolen. 2 are linked to an impound yard in Arizona that was shut down for corruption. The same Shell LLC owns the tavern they're using as a base. Felix added, they've got a flow of cash coming in from a pawn shop in Harrisburg that hasn't filed taxes in 5 years. That's where the money's cleaned. Rhodes tapped the photo of a heavy-set man with a goatee and mirrored sunglasses. This is Doyle Trent. On paper, he's a consultant. In practice, he funnels firearms from private sales in Kansas to Eastern buyers. Deacon, their so-called ringleader, here is just a branch manager. Eleanor closed her notebook and folded her hands in her lap. Rhodes continued. We cut Doyle's income stream. You take down the rest of the tree. The local crew will scatter. The larger network will implode within weeks. He turned to Felix. You planted the beacons on their bikes. All transmitting, Felix said. They're still unaware. Movement logs are syncing with the relay station. We can trace every stop they've made in the last 24 hours. Jonah pulled a cable from a case on the table and plugged it into the main laptop. We've also intercepted their burner texts, mostly threats, nothing they'd want published. I've queued them for scheduled release if any of us gets tagged. Worst case scenario, the FBI gets a full Dropbox by Friday morning. Rhodes gave a small nod, then turned to Eleanor. They won't know where the break came from, not until they're already too exposed to recover. Eleanor said nothing for a moment. Then, finally, leave no trace that ties it here, not even smoke. Rhodes understood. This wasn't revenge. It was a surgical collapse. They weren't looking to make a point with fire and chaos. They wanted quiet removal consequences delivered in silence. Operation Enswell begins tonight, he said. First wave is financial isolation. Jonah, you'll execute Phase 1 cutoff funding. By triggering a flagged transaction through the pawn shop, that'll freeze their accounts for at least 72 hours. Jonah nodded. Felix, target, there comes. I want every burner they're using, cloned and scrambled. Redirect any trace attempts to a dead drop in Topeka. Felix smirked. Already? Built the redirect. They'll think they're being hunted by locals. Eleanor asked, voice steady. Rhodes looked at her. You plant the final seed. When the time comes? She nodded once, and that was all. There was no applause, no speeches, just the sound of coordinated professionals slipping into the rhythm of something they hadn't done in years but never really forgot. Outside, the town remained dark. But inside the shed, Redstone Hollow had become a war room, and the battle wasn't for flowers, it was for peace. Real peace, the kind that only comes when the storm that threatens it is quietly dismantled from the root. The first crack appeared just after midnight, though no one in the gang recognized it for what it was. They thought it was just another hiccup in the system, a glitch in the tavern's power, a missing package from a courier who had never been late before. But by the time the sun rose over Redstone Hollow, the cracks had widened into fractures, and the men who'd once mocked the quiet town began to understand something far larger was unraveling beneath them. Stood over a table littered with phones, blueprints, and 2 sealed crates stamped with a government inventory code. The crates had arrived a month ago, unmarked but expected. Been rerouted from a logistics center in Ohio that suffered a data loss incident 6 weeks prior. Someone up the ladder had told them to hold the crates until pickup. They didn't ask questions. You didn't ask questions when the payoff came with silence and a tracking number that always vanished after delivery. But now, the phones didn't work. The crates showed up as flagged in a Department of Defense database, and one of their own had been arrested just south of the state line without ever making contact again. His vehicle burned out, his backup contact disconnected, and their cash frozen across 6 dummy accounts. No warning. Eleanor had timed the catalyst herself. 3 days earlier, the Mayfield shed had processed a specific signal through the relay box. It didn't look like mucha time-stamped pulse across a buried line that had lain dormant since 1993. That line led to a small hub just outside Quantico. It was an alert, a flag designed only to light up under one condition: when Unit 27, long since retired, classified and disbanded reported evidence of domestic laundering involving, thought she'd need to. But the moment she saw the serial code on the side of one of the bikers' crates, half hidden by a tarp, behind the tavern. She knew by the time Deacon realized they'd been exposed, the damage had already multiplied. The shipments were traced not just to the pawn shop in Harrisburg, but to a shell contractor registered in Virginia firm that no longer existed. The tech inside the crates was never meant to be in private hands. More than just chips, they included targeting modules and encrypted processors used in battlefield reconnaissance drones. This wasn't gang-level hardware, it was black-budget gear, and someone far above Deacon's level had used the biker network to hide it. But now, the chain was broken. In Washington, D.C., an interagency task force received the alert. Most of the young analysts had no idea who she was, but the few who did looked at one another wide-eyed. A quiet call was placed to an office buried 3 floors beneath the Pentagon. There, a man read the signal log and nodded once before saying, "She's still alive." Then, hours, the machinery of federal scrutiny turned its eye toward the Cobras not as a gang, but as a laundering front for missing government equipment. What had seemed like a local disturbance now stretched across 4 states, involving private couriers, dormant shell companies, and a quiet exodus of unnamed middlemen suddenly off-grid. Back in Redstone Hollow, Eleanor watched it unfold, not through headlines, but in silence. The chatter on their internal comms died down. Deacon began operating from behind closed tavern doors. The outsiders who used to walk the streets vanished overnight. Deliveries stopped. Felix confirmed the last link had gone dark. Rhodes stepped onto the porch that evening with a quiet sense of satisfaction. The front is collapsing. By the end of the week, the entire operation will be a ghost. Eleanor didn't smile. She simply said, "Then they'll finally see what real invisibility looks like." The woman they once called sweet, who sold flowers on Saturdays, had triggered a chain reaction that reached Washington without leaving her town, and no one, not even Deacon, would be able to trace it back. The headlines broke just after dawn. Not in Redstone Hollow's modest paper, but in the regional business section of a major state daily. It wasn't loud, no banner, no dramatic typeface, just a headline printed cleanly beneath the fold. Federal audit uncovers multi-state laundering ring tied to defense contractors. Below it, a photo of an unremarkable pawn shop in Harrisburg, the shutters pulled down and a notice taped to the inside of the glass by breakfast. 5 other locations across 3 counties had been raided not by armed squads or battering rams, but by men in dark suits carrying binders and credentials. Subpoenas were served, computers seized, bank accounts frozen mid-transaction. What few legitimate assets the Cobras owned were placed under review, then quietly reabsorbed by the government or creditors they hadn't known were watching. No guns were drawn. No doors kicked in, just paper pages that once filed did more damage than firepower ever could. In Redstone Hollow, the tavern door remained shut. The motorcycles out front had vanished overnight, their tracking beacons still pinging from rest stops and motels across the state as their riders scattered. Deacon hadn't been seen since the previous afternoon. His room at the boarding house was left unlocked, drawers empty, blinds swaying slightly, as if someone had left in a hurry and didn't want to be seen leaving at all. At Eleanor's house, the garden was quiet. The ground, still bruised from the tire tracks, had been turned over. Cody had returned each morning, not speaking unless spoken to, tending the soil like it was something sacred. His hands were rougher now, dirt under every nail, but he moved. With purpose, he had rebuilt the trellises without instruction, painted them the same soft cream they'd been before, and now he was planting against lowly, carefully one section at a time. Snapdragons first, then foxgloves, then the marigolds. Eleanor watched from the porch, silent. A pot of tea steamed beside her, untouched. Rhodes stepped out of the shed, a folded newspaper under one arm. "They filed formal charges this morning," he said. "Asset seizures in 5 counties. 2 of the accounts trace back to a defunct logistics firm with ties to federal contracts. They're calling it a multi-agency success." Eleanor raised an eyebrow but didn't speak. "They won't name names. No one will ever say your call started it," he added. "Good," she said. He unfolded the paper and handed it to her. She didn't take it. "I already know how it ends," she said. He nodded, tucking the paper back beneath his arm. The porch was still for a long time. The garden buzzed faintly with bees. Somewhere in the distance, the hum of an old lawnmower started. Up, like any other morning in a town that didn't ask too many questions, they'll try again, eventually, Rhodes said. Somewhere else, a different town, a different name. They always do, Eleanor replied. But you'll be here. She looked out at the garden, where Cody knelt beside a row of peonies, gently spacing each bulb. I'll be here, she said, and so will others. In the distance, the church bell chimed 10. A woman passed by with a stroller. A boy waved as he rode past on a bicycle. To them, the Mayfield house was the same as it had always been. Yellow siding, white trim, a woman, with tea and a garden, and no trouble to speak of. But beneath that garden, where the snapdragons now took root again, lay wires and sensors and a relay node disguised as an irrigation pump. The shed looked like a tool room again, but behind the far wall, the monitors still pulsed gently. Silent watchers for storms that hadn't yet arrived. No banners had been raised, no victory parades, but the enemy had been dismantled not by fire or force, but by precision and quiet. Lawful unraveling. No guns, just gardens, and that was always the point. It began subtly, as most shifts in perception do. The Sunday after the tavern closed, a few neighbors lingered a bit longer at the market stalls. Speaking in quieter tones, Mrs. Denning from the post office paused outside Eleanor's flower stand not for the tulips, but as if she meant to ask something else and hadn't yet found the courage. She left with a small bouquet and a puzzled look, murmuring, I never knew snapdragons could stand up that tall. At the hardware store, Mr. Talbot, who'd once dismissed Eleanor as the sweet lady who baked too many pies, now watched her from across the aisle when she came in for gloves and seed packets. When she asked for a specific gauge of copper wire something, rarely stocked he blinked, nodded, and told her he'd check the back room. He didn't ask why she needed it, but he wondered. Teenagers who used to roll their eyes when she passed now tipped their heads in greeting. The boys who once laughed at the flower cart on Market Street now made sure it didn't wobble on the uneven sidewalk. Someone, no one said, painted the small wooden sign in front of her garden, the Mayfield Bloom. They added a tiny emblem beneath the name, 3 red stars carved carefully into the wood. Eleanor said nothing about it, but she didn't remove it either. In the bakery, whispers floated between sips of coffee. I heard she worked for the State Department. Once no, she was intelligence-like, real intelligence, Cold War stuff. My uncle said she used to fly planes. She had a visitor last week, black SUV, no plates. That's not normal. Someone said they saw cables going from her shed to the old weather station. But how would she even? The theories varied wildly. Eleanor never confirmed any of them. When asked directly, she would only smile faintly and say, before the roses, I traveled a bit. Then she would go back to arranging stems as though nothing else mattered. But in the quiet hours, those closest to her began to wonder. Librarian Mrs. Kearns found a gap in the town's archive directory's years where Eleanor's name simply didn't appear. No address, no employment. Just a sudden reappearance in the late 1980s, marked only by a land deed and a utility hookup. The town council received a letter from the Department of Infrastructure inquiring about upgrades to the communication grid. Near Eleanor's block, when they replied with confusion, the inquiry was quietly withdrawn. Sheriff Blake Harlan hadn't spoken a word to Eleanor since the blackout, but he no longer drove past her house without tipping his hat, even if she wasn't outside to see it. At the diner, he once overheard someone call her just an old lady with plants, and he cut his biscuit in half without looking up and said, "You should be grateful. You never met her before the plants." That shut the table up for good. Church, she began to get small notes in the collection basket, not money notes, messages without names. You kept us safe. Thank you for what we don't understand. Whatever you did, it worked. One Sunday, a young girl approached Eleanor during the potluck and handed her a drawing. It showed a large garden, a woman in a red shawl, and 2 men in dark suits standing by a porch. At the bottom, in shaky cursive, "My mom says you were like a general. I think that's pretty cool." Eleanor framed it and placed it beside her window. She never asked for acknowledgement. She didn't explain the relay box, the men who came and went, or why her shed still clicked softly late at night. But the town began to remember, not in the loud, celebratory way of medals and flags, but in glances held a bit longer. In conversations, paused just before asking too much, in the way they now looked at the old woman with the steady hands and steel gray eyes, and realized that some people grow flowers, not to decorate, but to reclaim. Eleanor remained quiet, but Redstone Hollow had changed, and it would never look at her the same way again. It was late afternoon when the knock came, not sharp, not timid, but deliberate. Eleanor stood in the kitchen, slicing the ends off a bundle of rosemary when she paused mid-motion. She wiped her hands on a linen towel and moved to the front door, not in a rush. Few people knocked anymore, most simply called out or waved from the sidewalk. When she opened the door, there stood Mayor Lena Greaves, holding a modest bouquet of hydrangeas, her other hand awkwardly wrapped around the strap of her satchel. The mayor was dressed plainly, no sash, no formal badge, just slacks, and a soft blue cardigan, the same one she wore on her quieter days. Her face held a look that wasn't quite regret and wasn't quite reverence, but something between them. Good afternoon, Mrs. Mayfield, she said softly. Eleanor studied her for a moment, then stepped aside. Come in? The mayor nodded and entered, careful not to scuff the threshold. Inside, the Mayfield house smelled of lemon oil and something faintly earthy. A small radio hummed softly in the corner, playing a string quartet no one had announced. They sat in the front parlor, Eleanor in her usual chair by the window, the mayor settling into the seat opposite with a politeness that bordered on reverence. I didn't come as the mayor, she said. At least, not only. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, waiting. I came as someone who's lived in this town most of her life, Lena continued. Someone who walked past your garden 100 times. Someone who bought peonies for her daughter's graduation, who smiled and waved and never once asked what was behind your eyes when you looked at Main Street like you were still reading blueprints. Eleanor didn't speak. She simply let her settle. The mayor set the bouquet on the table between them. I brought these because I didn't know what else to bring. Seems silly now. Eleanor glanced at the flowers. They'll keep, thank you. Lena leaned forward, elbows on her knees, voice quieter now. You protected us. Still, Eleanor said nothing. The mayor's jaw tightened for a moment, then loosened. And we didn't protect you? We should have. We should have stepped in when those men disrespected you, when they tore through what you built. But we looked away, treated it like a prank, a misunderstanding, something not worth raising voices over. Outside, a breeze shifted the blinds. Light danced across the old wooden floor. I didn't know who you used to be, Lena admitted, but I do now. And I know that when things started falling apart for them, it wasn't luck or coincidence or some federal response plan. It was you, quietly, efficiently. Just like you used to train them, I'm told. Eleanor's hands remained folded in her lap. I don't expect you to say anything, Lena added, and I'm not here for answers. I needed you to know that we see you now. Not just the garden, not just the sweet woman with teacups and little seed packets. We see the wall behind the softness, the spine. For the first time since the visit began, Eleanor shifted. She looked up, not sharply, not with surprise, but with clarity. She studied Lena, as if weighing whether the apology had any weight behind it. I didn't do it for thanks, she said finally. I did it because there are some weeds that don't belong in anyone's soil. The mayor nodded slowly. Still, thank you. They sat in silence for a while, not awkwardly. Just the kind of silence shared between people who understood that words had limits, that some debts couldn't be repaid with plaques or statements, but only by carrying forward what had been protected. Eventually, Eleanor rose to put on a kettle. Lena didn't offer to help. She knew better. As the water boiled, the mayor stood to leave. At the door, she paused. If anything like this ever happens again, she said, you won't have to call anyone from outside town. Eleanor looked at her with a faint glint in her eyes. Let's hope that's true. The mayor left without fanfare. The flowers remained on the table, quietly taking root in the silence she left behind. The envelope arrived on a Thursday, tucked between a seed catalog and a water bill. The handwriting was unmistakable, blocky, neat, with the slight forward lean Connor had picked up after years of military form-filling and bureaucratic repetition. Eleanor recognized it immediately, even before she saw the airmail stamp from the other side of the world. She held it for a moment before opening it, Her hands were steady, but something in her chest tightened. The last letter from Connor had arrived nearly 4 months ago, dated weeks before that. Satellite connections were unstable where he was stationed. Emails were sporadic and sterile, but letters still held the weight of breath and ink and time. She brought it inside, set it gently on the kitchen table, and opened it with the same silver letter opener she'd used since 1974. The paper inside was worn but clean, folded twice, creased at the edges. She unfolded it and began to read. "Grandma, I hope this reaches you without delay. We've moved twice since my last note, one temporary camp, one more permanent, though that word means less and less the longer I'm here. The heat hasn't broken in weeks. The food tastes like memory foam. But I'm fine, I promise. They've kept me out of the more dangerous zones since the last incident. They say I've earned my quiet rotation. I think they're trying to keep me from stirring anything else up. I've learned to take that as a compliment." Eleanor smiled faintly. At that, Connor never did know when to stop asking questions. It had nearly cost him his commission, more than once. News travels strange out here. It's not fast, but it's sticky. It stays. People whisper more than they write. And someone somehow got wind of what happened back home, not the official version, the real one. They said a widow's garden was torn apart by a gang. And they said the gang doesn't exist anymore, at least not on paper, not where it counts. I knew before I even confirmed it that it had to be you. No one said your name, but I didn't need them to. I just smiled and said, then she handled it. The others looked at me like I was bluffing, like it was some local legend or exaggerated town tale. But I told them, I said, my grandmother doesn't yell. She calculates, she waits, and when she acts, things change. And they did, didn't they? Eleanor's eyes moved slowly across the page. The light from the window hit the words just right, making the ink shimmer slightly. I saw a photo someone uploaded of the garden last week. Looked like early morning mist still on the ground. Snapdragons were already coming up again. Thought you might like to know. Some guys in my unit asked if you were ever in the military. I laughed and told them no. I said you trained people who trained people who trained people like us. One of the new guys asked if that made you dangerous. I said no. It makes her the reason I came home the first time. Eleanor felt her hands tighten slightly around the letter. Not from emotion, but from something older, recognition, a knowing. You taught me how to survive things that don't come with manuals, and you reminded me that quiet strength doesn't ask for validation, it just moves. So when I heard about what happened, I wasn't surprised. I was proud. I told them you'd never let them win, not even once. Be well, Grandma, you've got more people watching than you know, and a few of them now understand why I never called anyone else family. All my love. Connor Linner folded the letter back along its original creases. She didn't cry. She rarely did. Instead, she moved to the mantel and placed the envelope between a framed photo of Connor in his academy uniform and a pressed flower beneath glass. Then she returned to the garden, where the snapdragons were beginning to reach again toward the sun. The tulips had begun to open by mid-April, their red and yellow petals folding outward like small declarations. The soil was still soft, enriched by weeks of care and quiet planning. What once had been mangled by tire tracks and beer cans now stood as a symmetrical blend of restored paths, new growth, and something Eleanor had not allowed in her garden in over 3 decades, permanence. At the center of the rebuilt garden, where her snapdragons had once stood tallest, now sat a wooden bench, not just any bench. This one was crafted by hand from reclaimed oak beams, stained a deep walnut, sealed to withstand the seasons. It had taken 3 men from our students of hers, each with hands that had once broken down carbines and rigged silent traps to build. It exactly to spec. It was heavy, immovable without effort, and yet sat in the garden like it had always belonged. The engraving was subtle, just deep enough to catch the light at the right angle. Along the upper slat of the backrest, in clean serif letters, were the names of 22 individuals. First names only. No ranks, no dates, no fanfare. Just the names of those who had served under Eleanor during the years when she didn't sell flowers. When her hands were calloused from something other than pruning shears, Unit 27, the ones who never officially existed, The ones trained not just in tactics, but in ethics, restraint, subversion, and resilience. Men and women who had gone on to become analysts, consultants, teachers, and in some cases ghosts. Some were no longer living. One had been lost during a covert extraction gone wrong in Ancora. Another had died in a civilian hospital under a different name. Eleanor remembered each dot. It was her idea to make the bench, not for herself, not as a memorial, but as a quiet anchor, a signal to those who might pass through Redstone Hollow and wonder if the stories they'd heard in war rooms or whispered briefings had ever been true. Here was proof, not with medals or salutes, but with something that offered rest. The townspeople didn't ask much about it. They called it the memory bench, assuming it was for her late husband or perhaps her grandson. They didn't notice the names, or if they did, thought they were family. In a way, they were. Every morning, Eleanor made tea and sat beside the tulips. She didn't always sit on the bench itself. Sometimes she stayed nearby, just within sight, as if watching over those names, as if expecting someone to arrive and find themselves on that list. Rhodes visited once a week and always sat there for a minute or two, never saying a word. Cody came by almost daily now, helping maintain the rows. He asked about the names once. Just once. She told him they were good people. That's all. You need to know. One Tuesday, a woman in a tan coat stopped by. She said nothing at first, just walked through the garden slowly. Then she sat at the bench, her hand brushing over one name near the center, her eyes filled with something unspoken. She sat still for 10 minutes, then rose and left a single coin on the bench before departing. Eleanor didn't follow. She simply waited until the woman had gone, then retrieved the Koina military token from an agency that officially no longer existed. She placed it in a tin beneath her sink. Among others, the garden bloomed louder than it had in years. Birds returned. Children walked the path again with their parents, unaware of the weight beneath the soil. And yet, those who knew Thos Fugue came quietly. They understood what the bench meant. It wasn't a place to grieve, it was a place to remember. The kettle hissed just as the sun crested over the hedgerow, spilling golden light across Eleanor's countertop. She moved without rush, her hands steady as they cradled the worn ceramic mug, the same one Connor had made for her in 6th grade crooked. Handle, faded glaze, and the name Graham etched unevenly into the side. She filled it with tea, the scent of chamomile and mint rising with the steam. Outside, the air was cool, but not sharp, the kind of morning that hinted at spring but didn't declare it. She stepped onto the porch with her sun hat in one hand, a linen napkin in the other, and paused to let the breeze move through her. The rocking chair creaked gently as she settled into it, tea in hand, eyes on the garden. The tulips were in bloom now, and the snapdragons had started to hold their heads high again. Marigolds danced lightly in the breeze. It was the kind of garden that looked untouched, though Eleanor knew better. It had been torn open, remade. The new roots were stronger than the old ones ever were. She sipped her tea and exhaled through her nose, letting silence settle around her like a shawl. From the porch, she could see the bench, the names. A reminder, not of violence or shadows, but of choices made carefully, of people she had trained not just to fight, but to know when not to. She didn't stare at it long, just enough to know it was still there. She stood after a few minutes and made her way to the roses along the east side of the garden. Her gait was slower than it once was, but her movements were sure. She carried a small metal watering can, the spout dulled from use, the handle wrapped in cloth to keep it from biting into her palm. At the rose trellis, she knelt gently now, all the way down, just enough to lean in. She adjusted one of the trellis beams slightly, brushing away a bit of dirt from its base. The small transmitter hidden inside was invisible unless you knew what to look for. It hadn't pulsed in weeks, not since the tavern went dark, but it remained, tucked behind the trailing vines, powered by a long-life cell and connected to a line buried 6 inches beneath the soil. She didn't test it. She didn't have to. It was ready still. Eleanor watered the roses with care, making sure the roots weren't over-soaked. She hummed as she worked something old, wordless, a tune from childhood maybe, or something she'd heard on a radio during a far-off assignment. Long before Redstone Hollow became home, behind her, Cody arrived quietly and began working along the north bed. He didn't interrupt. They rarely spoke before noon. Not from rudeness, but from a shared understanding that mornings belonged to stillness. At the far end of the path, the Mayfield bloom sign swayed gently. The 3 stars beneath it caught the sunlight in a way they hadn't when they were first carved sharper now. As if time had decided to remember instead of forget. A few neighbors passed by on their way to the bakery. Some waved, some simply nodded. The reverence hadn't faded, but it had changed shape. No more questions, no more curiosity, just quiet respect. Eleanor straightened slowly and moved to the next row. No urgency, no tension. She knew better than anyone that peace didn't mean peace forever. But it meant peace for now, and that was enough. She watered the lavender next, brushing a bead gently off one blossom with the back of her hand. The transmitter behind the trellis stayed silent, but it was there just in case. The morning sun grew warmer. Eleanor adjusted. Her hat sipped the last of her tea and moved to the next plant. She watered what was worth keeping.